Yeah, Mike's not on,
Button
Professor?
up, please, Professor.
I'm reading your commentary for my turn this week, where you quote me saying that Rhode Island voters, I doubted whether Rhode Island voters could make a rational decision on the ballot question. I wonder what you mean, whether I thought that Rhode Islanders were too dumb? Or did you mean that I thought that Rhode Islanders were too dumb? Or was that it was a very complex problem that they didn't have correct information to make a decision on?
I wasn't sure how to interpret what your question was to the woman from the National Coalition of State Legislators. As I recall your question, you basically gave her a leading question which asked, can Rhode Island voters, I'm going to paraphrase, I don't have your exact language in front of me. As I remember it, I believe what you said was to the effect, can Rhode Island voters make a rational decision about this? That was pretty much the summation of what you asked. I personally believe that, yes, the voters are fully capable of making a decision when a carefully prepared ballot question is put forward. And we have modified our Constitution many times in the past using this methodology, and we'll do it again.
Where do the Rhode Islanders, where do they get this information? I read the Providence Journal pretty carefully, and it seems to be only one side on it.
Which information are you talking about?
About the effects of the line item veto. For example, it says the governor in one of her items and the editor of the letters to the editor always point out that it's going to reduce corruption. Do you think that's so?
Well, corruption is a broad word. I think that if there's an improper budget item, if there's a last-minute budget, is a last-minute budget item corrupt? Some people might think so, some people might not. But I'd say in general, if we can dissuade that kind of last-minute, and I'm going to call it shenanigans for lack of a better word.
About corruption.
Well, I mean, again, some people consider that sort of activity corrupt.
Yes, and is it corrupt? I'm asking you.
I think it depends on a case-by-case basis. If there's a line item that benefits one individual that shows up in the last 24 hours of the session, I would call that corrupt.
Why?
Because it's a special deal for one person, and it should have gone through a full vetting, and instead it didn't, and it showed up with just hours to go before the budget vote. And in that circumstance, that's a problem, I think. That's not the way government's supposed to work.
The governor submits the budget, right?
Back in January or February, right.
How many people are involved in that decision of the governor?
I have no idea.
How many hearings does she have on the budget that she submits?
Well, the governor's process is not a public process.
Folks, I'm gonna interject here, in terms of point of procedure. Professor, if you're gonna ask your questions, ask them through the chair, please, so that there's not this go back and forth going on, because we've got a lot of people to get to. So,
Well, certain statements have been made about the line item veto about how many people are in favor in Rhode Island. How do we know that?
well, that's a fair.
Well,
Are you attributing that to Mr. Block saying that?
Actually, it is. It's on his website.
Okay. To the extent that you've said that, Mr. Block,
It's a
how do you
public
defend
poll
it?
that was conducted by the Hassenfeld Initiative.
What information do the people have on the public poll? It seems to me the only thing I've read is that 66% of the people are in favor of it. I didn't see any sampling error, how large the sample was, when it was conducted,
Well,
how the interviewers were. I mean,
No.
well, I'm pointing out that these statements were made as if this is a found fact, that the people of Rhode Island have this information.
You
They
were,
do not have
Professor,
it.
you were certainly wiser than I am. You've had more years on this earth than I have. If we believe everything that's given to us, then we would all be very naive. We get a lot of data. We can just, this committee is going to deliberate about that issue, and whether it's true, false, or indifferent, we can give it the proper weight that we would, and forgive me for using a legal analogy, but, and I'm sure the general will agree with me, we'll give it, and Mr. Belasco and the judge, will give it the weight that it deserves. But to get into this back and forth with Mr. Block, I think, respectfully, we need to move on with other witnesses.
In other words, we just accept what they tell us as fact?
Forgive me, I didn't say that at all, sir. What I said was, Mr. Block made a statement. We can choose to agree with that or not agree with it, to read into it, to weight it as we want to disregard it, to do anything we want to do with it, as with all testimony that comes before all of our bodies in this great these great hallowed halls.
I resign.
Thank you, Professor.
General?
Yes, thank you, Senator Lombardi and Representative Marshall. Mr. Block, I have one question. I believe you indicated the governor's process is not a public process. Is that correct?
Right, I don't believe that as the governor constructs the budget, that that's done in a hearing environment. I believe that that happens outside of public hearings and testimony and that sort of thing.
May I ask you a question, if I might? Do you prefer to have that be a public process?
You know, I suppose that there would be public benefit to having some of that be done in public, I think for sure. Do we need two sets of public input on one budget? You know, if the legislative side puts the whole budget out and allows for public input, is there a public benefit to doing that again on the governor's side? I'm not sure how to answer that. I really haven't thought about that situation before. But I don't know that the public generally needs more than one set of open hearings on the same budget.
Thank you. And one last question, if I might.
Yes, General.
And I'm not trying to put anyone on the spot, so don't misunderstand me. You are a student of the budget. There's no question about that. I enjoy reading your commentaries, and think you are a very learned man, as well as a very learned candidate in your time. With that said, do you have any example of a portion of the budget which you would have reviewed were you governor and exercised a line item veto? And I apologize, certainly, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but is there anything in the forefront of your mind?
I'm pretty sure I got that question in some debate or other at some point in time. I don't want anyone to misconstrue my words. I'm not running for governor at this point in time, so I don't need the Providence Journal running out and saying it. But were I governor, personally, I would take a look at every aspect of the budget because ultimately, especially coming in, I think you have to put your head around how we spend our money, where we spend it, and then once my team's budget was constructed and then it goes through to the legislature, the amount of changes that can happen, and I say this not so much for your benefit but for the people behind me, when the governor's budget is transmitted to the legislature, at that point in time, it could be that the legislature takes that budget and completely changes it, top to bottom. It's possible to do. There's nothing that stops that sort of thing. So on the light item situation, what happens to the original budget and what form it comes out in would very largely drive my decision-making on which elements of the budget I would look most carefully at. If a piece of the budget that I constructed was left largely alone, I obviously would leave that part of the budget alone. Ones that were touched more heavily, and especially additions to, would be the place I would focus most on. So it's not so much which agency of government I would be most focused on, it would be where the changes are and where the additions are is where I would personally spend my time looking.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Block, Professor, to the extent that it may have been perceived that I shut you down on your questioning, do you have any other questions for Mr. Block?
He said he has tons of questions.
Okay.
You said that thousands of Rhode Islanders have written letters in favor of the line item veto.
Yes.
I noticed on your website that you encourage Rhode Islanders to write, and you give the names of all the people they should
Yep.
write to. I also noticed that in Providence Journal, the editor there has on a number of occasions listed the same names of the people and encouraged people to write to them. Do you know of any effort by anybody else to write in against it?
I know very few people who are against the line item veto.
Any organized organization that are urging people to write against it?
No.
So the complete organization for these letters to the editor happened to be from groups in favor of it.
Yeah, are you implying that the only reason that there are letters pro is because there's an organization
I would-
advocating for?
I would like to know where they come from, but I see that Common Cause, you, and the Providence Journal are all urging people to do it. I imagine that should have some effect.
Well, I guess I would ask a different question. How come there's no organization advocating against?
Oh, well, that's it. That's because of the level of knowledge among the Rhode Islanders, don't you think? How many Rhode Islanders know that the governor of Wisconsin can strike a number of like $25 million, cross out the 2 and make it a $5 million expenditure?
I'm going to assume almost none, right?
Yeah, okay.
But that's also your job to make sure that we have a responsible version of the line item veto that comes out.
No, that's not my job. My job is to make a decision on whether the people of Rhode Island really want it and whether it's really good for Rhode Island government.
Can I ask a question? I don't want to.
Well, I don't think, respectfully, I think we're going into,
Yeah.
I don't think you should be
That's
asking
why I
questions.
asked. Okay.
Yeah, and with all due respect to all of you that have come and taken time out of your schedule, and to respect to our commission members and their time as well, and their professions, I do have a question that Representative Amore has.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Block. And we've spoken about this on multiple occasions. And so I was identified in the Journal, not by name, but as being opposed to this. And I'm not opposed. I have concerns. So I know you've watched or read the transcripts from these hearings. I'd just like you to respond to, I think it was Professor LeDuc's description of, and I'll make it East Providence centric. If I come in here and fight tooth and nail for an increase in funding for the residential beds at Bradley Hospital, which affects my district, and those students are in East Providence schools, and over the course of 10 years, East Providence hemorrhaged close to $1 million serving students that weren't from East Providence. And I come in here fighting for that on a daily basis. And I convince my colleagues and I convince the leadership that this needs to be in the budget. And I win that victory over 3 years, 3 long years of trying to plead my case. And perhaps the governor lines that out because she disagrees with me on the expansion of charter schools. I would contend, because we're not a full-time legislature, my colleagues will not come back to override that, even though that's good policy statewide. It doesn't interest the vast majority of my colleagues. And it can be abused on the other end, just as you say, it can be abused, and I don't disagree with you, in the last minutes of a budget process. Now, I've been on the Finance Committee for 4 years. I have not witnessed that, but I know of which you speak. I have read, I have a decent knowledge of the history of the state. So I just like your response to that, because I think that was a pragmatic issue that the professor brought up. I can apply it to something that I particularly worked on, and I'd like your response to that. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. So it's very difficult for me to put myself into some other person's head, specifically a governor of the state. I can speak hypothetically for myself, if I was sitting in that chair, what I would do, and what I would hope most responsible governors would do, because as the governor, I think more than probably any other position in the state, you're constantly in the spotlight, and your decisions are examined under a microscope, right? I mean, there's no two ways about it. There's probably no more thorough review of decision-making than the decision-makings that our governor makes. Having said that, I think it's a little unlikely that the scenario that you constructed, as you put it, and I understand it's a hypothetical, that a governor would strike that particular line item just because of the optics, the recipient, and all the other things. It seems to me that the most likely targets for gubernatorial line item strikes are going to be the ones that are stinkier. I can't think of a better way to put it, right? It's going to be the ones that are sketchier, the ones that are added in the last minute. If you've been banging the drum on an issue for 4 years, that's not going to be unknown to your colleagues around you, and it's not going to be unknown to the governor and the governor's staff as they figure out what to strike and not to strike. So I don't personally believe that you're going to see, I could always be wrong about this, but I don't believe you're going to see a vindictive governor going after really valid and good line items because they don't like a particular individual or anything along those lines. I've got to believe, and I believe across the country, the way the veto is most commonly used is it's used sparingly. It's not used in a slash and burn, in most circumstances, in a slash and burn type way. And I'm sure you're aware that the vast majority of line strikes are overridden to begin with. So, and it's really the ones that are the hardest ones to defend, those are the ones that get struck. And I would argue if it can't be defended on the override, it probably shouldn't be there in the first place.
And there's merit to what you say, but I think that in the instance that I use, and I think there's probably a dozen of those situations in every budget, I don't think anybody knows about that. I think that's way under the radar. And we've seen a governor shut down a roadway on the George Washington Bridge out of vindictiveness. I mean, there is the ability to push your agenda through the tools of government. We see it all the time. And if there is nefarious intent on the budget side in the General Assembly to last minute, then obviously there can be nefarious intent on the other side. And I would disagree that this type of budget item gets any spotlight at all. But thank you for your testimony. We've had a back and forth on this. I appreciate the back and forth. It's been informative to me.
And I appreciate it too. Thank you.
Senator Sheehan.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I would just want to respond to one of my good colleagues, Professor, about promoting issues and stuff. I think any organization that promotes an issue in our republic, the whole idea is to gather support behind it. I can't think of off the top of my head any reform to government or a positive change that just spontaneously erupted and occurred. It is a group. So to take, like, for example, the women's rights movement looking for seeking enfranchisement, the suffrage. The 19th Amendment took great effort to become a change to the Constitution. You could have argued that who's in favor of that? What's the poll numbers? Now, we take any poll number with a grain of salt, and you have yours, and you can provide the methodology to the professor if you choose. So we would decide, we, the General Assembly, if this amendment to the Constitution is a valid one that gathers and garners support from the public. That's our job to determine whether or not you bring a poll forward or not. We are going to be the arbiters of that. And then, of course, if we were to approve this, the voters themselves would have to ratify the amendment, and they would be the final arbiters of whether or not we want to amend the Constitution, and they would have to be, you would hope, at least the majority of them voting thereon, would be informed enough to say yes or no. The other point is, really, I think what we're talking about here is whether or not we're going to give the governor another tool, perhaps another negotiating tool with the General Assembly. The governor proposes a budget, goes to the General Assembly, starts on the House, and will form a budget, will come to the Senate, will approve the budget. The governor already has, according to our Constitution, the opportunity to veto. The difference between a line item veto, of course, as everyone knows, I hope, is that you can selectively select one item to be surgically removed from that budget to veto one item. What that does is focuses the public attention on that particular item as to whether or not it merits a veto override. And of course, again, the General Assembly would have the final say. And unlike at the national level, where it takes a 2/3 vote to override the president's veto, it only takes 60%. It's less. It's not mere, but it's certainly less to override that veto. And I concur with Mr. Block in his statement that I don't see this as something that the governor would use irresponsibly. I'm not saying every governor would be that way, but I think a serious-minded governor who cares about the public would try to put the public's interest first. And that's true of the General Assembly as well as it is for the governor, as well as it is for the courts. All right, that's hopefully what we do in terms of public service. So this is a tool, as I said, I think it's a negotiating tool that sharpens people's focus on particular aspects of the budget. And rather than the governor vetoing the budget in toto, the governor would have an opportunity to selectively pick those items which he or she believes are inappropriate, overspending, whatever reason. But again, looking at my colleagues in the room, the General Assembly would have the final say. If we feel strongly about something, we've done this. I've been up here long enough to know if we feel strongly about something, we'll override. And I think on your case, Representative, I'd be there with you, and hopefully the Senate, along with the House, would override something along those lines. Thank you.
I don't think there was a question in that statement.
It was a comment. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay. General.
Just very briefly, Mr. Block, I did hear someone mention common cause. In the interest of full disclosure, I neglected to advise that I was a former board member of Common Cause. And in conclusion, I'd like to thank you for the tenacity that you've exhibited over the years in staying involved in government. It is not easy. We know that. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for your comments.
Mr.
I appreciate it, and we all do.
Thank you, Mr. Block. Let's hope you haven't set the precedent for the rest of the evening, though.